de Barcelona, a la Direcció de Serveis de Drets de Ciutadania. No us veig les cares, però pels noms que veig de les persones que ens esteu escoltant en aquests moments ens coneixem moltes, d'altres no. En tot cas, moltes gràcies per connectar-vos i benvingudes totes a aquest seminari. Si em permeteu, canviaré al castellà, perquè l'Israel, la persona que ens acompanya amb el castellà, ens pot seguir, ens pot entendre y así facilitaremos la comprensión. En primer lugar, como decía, aparte de daros la bienvenida, darle las gracias al Israel Butler, que trabaja en la organización no gubernamental Liberties, que tiene base en Berlín y Bruselas, que será quien nos acompañará en este seminario que ahora os presentaré. Pero antes quería también contextualizar un poco por qué estamos organizando este seminario, que es una actividad que organiza el Centro de Recursos en Derechos Humanos del Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, y quiero dar las gracias a Iris Aviñó, a Julia Grané y a Celia Castellano, que son las personas que trabajan en el centro y que han hecho posible que nos podamos encontrar esta mañana aquí. Es nuestro, diríamos como actividad, nuestro primer seminario online. Yo creo que en estos 2 meses a todas nos ha dado tiempo a estar de una manera u otra en este tipo de espacios y parece que ya nos hemos hecho expertas, pero es cierto que la parte de interacción, y ahora lo hablábamos con Israel, cuando se hace de esta manera, ¿no? Que los que hablamos se nos ven las caras, pero al resto no, es un poco complicado, pero en todo caso intentaremos que la comunicación sea fluida y las ideas lleguen. Como decía, Israel trabaja en Liberties, es el autor de una guía que hemos acompañado en la difusión de este seminario sobre cómo comunicar temas de derechos humanos en tiempos de crisis. Esta guía nos pareció, cuando la leímos, nos llegó a nuestras manos, nos pareció muy relevante porque tocaba un aspecto que a todas las personas que nos hemos dedicado a la defensa de derechos humanos, y la lista de personas que estáis aquí, pues venís todas de este ámbito, unos dilemas que se nos han planteado muchas veces, cuando en los momentos de crisis, ya sea producida por una guerra o producida por una crisis sanitaria como en estos momentos, o la económica del 2008, hablar de derechos y hablar de espacios de libertades es visto y es leído desde muchos espacios como confrontamiento y como una dicotomía respecto de los aspectos de seguridad y los aspectos, en este caso cuando estamos hablando de la COVID, sanitarios. Y esta dicotomía, que es falsa, y todas las que estamos aquí estamos seguros, digamos, convencidas ya de que es una dicotomía falsa, y que hablar de más derechos no quiere decir hablar de menos seguridad en ningún caso, no es así como es percibida por la inmensa mayoría de las personas. Y nos parecía que era muy pertinente pararnos a pensar y tener un espacio para reflexionar sobre entonces cómo hay que comunicar. Porque muchas veces somos nosotras mismas las que con nuestras campañas de comunicación o con nuestros artículos o nuestros posicionamientos quizás alimentamos esta dicotomía y esta visión desde fuera de esta dicotomía, y que por tanto había que darle vueltas a cómo lo comunicábamos. Y en el contexto de la COVID, cuando se están planteando mecanismos de rastreo de datos personales y de datos sanitarios muy sensibles, donde se está planteando si se nos tiene que tomar la temperatura para poder permitirnos acceder a un servicio o otros aspectos, es muy necesario que planteemos la seguridad humana desde un punto de vista amplio y por tanto que podamos explicar cómo esto no tiene que ser visto y leído como menos seguridad. Y esta es la razón de ser de este espacio, de este momento que nos damos de 1 horita y media, y que estructuraremos de la siguiente manera que os explico. Le pasaré la palabra a Israel, que hará su presentación, que más o menos durará 40-45 minutos. Como visteis por la difusión, lo hará en inglés, que es en el idioma en el que se maneja mejor para para presentarlo, aunque como digo, el castellano lo entiende muy bien y ahora me dirá que sí, ¿verdad? Con la cabeza, por supuesto. Y después de esta presentación procederemos a una media hora de preguntas y respuestas en el chat, perdón, en el apartado de preguntas y respuestas que tenéis que tener debajo de vuestra pantalla. Pondremos las instrucciones, pero en todo caso lo que os pedimos es que en este apartado digáis cuál es vuestro nombre y la organización y que queréis hacer una pregunta. No hace falta que escribáis la pregunta por escrito, nos servirá para poder moderar después y poder dar las palabras. Después de que acabe Israel, que haremos en bloques de 3 preguntas, os pediremos entonces que os abráis el micro para que podáis hacer la pregunta oralmente. Si la hacéis en castellano o catalán, si Israel necesita que le ayudemos con la traducción, le ayudaremos. Y si la queréis hacer en inglés directamente más rápido, pues como sintáis más cómodas. En todo caso, yo no gasto más minutos y le paso la palabra a Israel, que creo que nos puede ayudar a todas y darnos, como se dice en inglés, mucho food for thoughts para poder entomar lo que tenemos y lo que se nos viene encima con un enfoque de derechos de verdad y bien comprendido como tal. Y thank you very much, Israel. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Okay, we have a lot of ground to cover and not so much time, so I will dive straight in. Thank you for the introduction. Before I start talking about the issue itself, I just want to say a quick word about terminology that I will use. I'm going to use the terms progressive and authoritarian quite often. When I use the term progressive, I'm not using it in the party political sense. So it's just a shortcut to say in favor of things like human rights, social justice, environmental protection. And when I use the term authoritarian, it's basically just being anti these things. So anti-rule of law, anti-democracy, anti-human rights. Okay, so what is values-based framing? The guide that I wrote was based on this communications technique, and it's based on research from the brain sciences, so cognitive sciences, about how the language we use, especially politicians in the media, can influence people's attitudes on political and social questions. And basically, this research explains how the fear-based and divisive narratives that authoritarians use can build support for things like racism, misogynism, homophobia, restrictions on civil liberties, or being against environmental protection, for example. But there's also a lot of research out there on how progressives can frame our communications in a way that creates support for our issues like inclusion, integration, and civil liberties. So for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to try and take you through 3 blocks. First, I'm going to explain very quickly how people form their attitudes on issues, and in particular, the role that language plays at a psychological level in changing how we think about an issue. Second, we'll look at the kinds of things that we need to try to avoid doing when we communicate. So there are some things that we do in our sector, me included. I work for a human rights NGO. My history is with in this field. So some things that we in our sector do that can make people tune out of our message, or even worse, actually turn people against the causes that we're trying to promote. And then in the last piece of a bit of time that I have, I'd like to talk about how we should be communicating instead if we want to create support for human rights and social justice issues. I'm going to be concentrating mostly on how we apply values-based framing to speaking to a public audience. So you can and should apply framing also when you're talking to like an expert audience, or if you're talking directly to policymakers. But today, I'm going to focus more on how you do this when you're talking to the public, and in particular, 2 segments in the public. So first, those people who are already predisposed to supporting progressive causes, you might refer to them as your base. And second, people who have more conflicted views about our issues. So these people are sometimes called the movable middle, or swayables, or persuadables. And they're referred to in this way because they can change their attitudes on a topic depending on the kind of messaging that they get. And generally, this middle group is the biggest group in society when you segment down the way that a society is divided in its opinions. And unfortunately, authoritarians like Vox in Spain are very good at reaching them. And in general, the way that we progressives communicate, we're not very good at reaching them. I'm also going to assume that you've all been able to read the guide. So I won't go through the guide itself. Of course, if you've got questions that relate to things that I say in the guide, there's always the last half hour to do that. So I'm going to start off with a quick poll. How much of the decision making that takes place in the brain do you think happens at a conscious or a rational level? So when we're taking choices, how much of that decision making in the mind is happening through kind of active logical thinking? You can use the chat to vote. So if you think it's more than 50% of that we use logic, then type more. And if you think that we use logic for less than 50% of what of our decision making, you type less. I'll just give you a moment to do that. Okay. Yeah, that's actually very good. Yeah, it's true. So the answer is that it's a lot less. Over 90% of the decision making in our mind is done through subconscious processes. So we're not really the rational beings that a lot of us assume that we are. So most of our decisions on and our attitudes around social and political questions are actually determined by the values that we prioritize. And these values operate at a subconscious level. They tend to work in the background. We're not really always aware of them. And it's not that we don't use logic and rationality ever. So sometimes we are forced to think about the choices that we're faced with, and then we may consciously and with effort apply rationality and logic to do what we think is right. Some of us, especially in the human rights sector, are trained to think in this rational way. So especially lawyers, for example, you're trained to make very clinical arguments. But for most of the population, most of the people who are trying to get through, that's not how the brain works. And the problem is that progressives generally, we're educated to think that the rational mind is in charge. We're educated to think that the truth can set people free. And that makes us believe instinctively that we need to communicate just using facts and rational arguments. And it doesn't really work very well. So if we really want to persuade people to change their attitudes on something like discrimination against ethnic minorities, or if we want them to do something like sign a petition to regularize undocumented migrants, then just using rational arguments isn't very effective. We have to talk in a way that activates certain values held in the subconscious. So what we do is we transport the logic and the facts to our audience in a way that also appeals to their values. So we don't stop using facts, we don't stop using logic, but the clothes that they have to be wearing have to be values clothes, if you like. Okay, so what are values? What are these values? You can see here what is referred to as a values map, and it's kind of a map of the brain, I guess. Values are deeply held guiding principles that shape how we see the world, how we think society should function, what motivates us, our attitudes, and ultimately then how we behave. I don't have time now to take you through this in a lot of depth. We do other workshops where we can spend more time on this. So I'm going to whiz through this. But basically, researchers have found that there are kind of probably around 58 values that can be grouped into these clusters. And they're present across all societies. So the research is cross-cultural, and there's a few decades of research proving this. So these values are present in the subconscious of all human beings, but to different extents. So they're all there, but different people and different societies put different priority on different combinations of values. But say, for example, if you are someone who prioritizes self-direction, then what is important for you is a world where people can be creative and free and independent. If you are someone who prioritizes universalism, what is important for you is that everybody in the world is treated fairly and that we embrace people who are different to us and we care about nature and people who aren't necessarily part of our immediate group. If you're someone who puts a lot of priority on the value of benevolence, then what's important for you is helping people in your community, being a good neighbor, being reliable, loyal, and honest. And what's interesting is that if you're someone who places emphasis on these values, then generally speaking, you're somebody who supports equality, supports human rights, is more welcoming of migrants, more caring for the environment. You are supportive of a redistributive welfare system. You care about where your clothes and your food come from, for example. So these values underpin progressive attitudes. And if you can use narratives, if you can create narratives that activate and trigger these values, you're more likely to create support for the progressive issues you're trying to promote. Okay, so that's the nice stuff, but then there's the lower half of the chart as well. I'm not going to talk about hedonism and stimulation here because it's not quite clear how they relate to political attitudes, but these other values here, conformity, if you prioritize conformity, you care more about sticking to the rules and not rocking the boat. Tradition, if you prioritize tradition, you believe it's important that religious rules and that cultural traditions should be maintained and preserved. If you prioritize security, then what's important to you is that there is physical security, that there is you're in good health. And if you prioritize things like achievement and power, what you care about is, for power, it's more accumulating wealth and influence so that you can have influence over others and kind of control your life, but also control the lives of other people. And for achievement, what you think is important is that people should strive to be successful, and you believe that kind of the people who do best, who work hardest, are on the top, and they deserve to be on top, and there's kind of a natural hierarchy in society. So as you might have guessed, if you are somebody who places greater priority on these values in the subconscious, then you tend to have more authoritarian attitudes. You tend to be more opposed to equality and human rights. You are opposed to activism. You favor a strong law and order approach. You tend to be prejudiced against marginalized groups. You don't even want to mix with them, let alone promote equality. You tend to endorse blind patriotism and traditional morality. So if you end up activating these values in your communications, then you will end up producing support for the wrong kinds of attitudes. I'm going to show you how we do that in a moment. But first, I'm going to give you a little bit more insight into the way values work. So here it's just a different representation. So the three groups that I was talking about on top that underpin progressive values are here. Then the other clusters I was talking about that underpin authoritarian attitudes are here. One way to see how these fit together is that self-direction, universalism, and benevolence are much more strongly connected to hope and empathy. So the idea of being outward-looking and free and embracing of others, of differences, and that gives you hope. You don't feel threatened by it. In fact, it's an opportunity to create brighter futures. Whereas if you look at the lower half of the wheel, these values are strongly connected to fear of losing things, either fear of losing your culture or losing your safety or losing the traditional hierarchies in society. So it's about holding on to what you've got. And what that means is that it's very easy to trigger these values if you use fear-based messaging that portrays certain groups as a threat to culture, religion, law and order, traditions, and social and economic hierarchies in society. So, if you have this in mind, then you can see quite clearly that authoritarians are actually very good at using values-based framing. Of course, they're appealing to the values on the lower half of this wheel. But what they tend to do is identify marginalized groups. And they tend to be very similar in all countries. There are some differences depending on what is culturally relevant in a given country. But then they will create narratives where they pick a marginalized group and then portray that group as creating a threat to security. For example, they will try to associate migrants or ethnic minorities with crime. Or they might try to associate certain migrants with a threat to culture or religion. Or they might try to associate environmentalists, for example, with a threat to our economic stability. Or they will try to associate these groups with sources of competition. So groups that are trying to disrupt traditional hierarchies. If you look, for example, at the backlash against feminism, the narrative around that is that they're trying to displace the position of men in society, and women are so-called taking over. So you can see that authoritarians are actually very good at using fear to activate these kinds of values. That's values in a nutshell. Two things to keep in mind. One is fear of loss, and the other thing is division. So all of the marginalized groups in these narratives used by authoritarians are portrayed as others. So they're labeled as foreigners, invaders, traitors. They're often dehumanized as animals or insects. And the narratives will emphasize differences in lifestyle, appearance, culture, language. Why? It's because evolution has hardwired us to see outsiders as potentially threatening, but also because authoritarians need us not to feel empathy towards the people they're targeting. Because if you don't feel empathy towards them, it's much easier to scapegoat them and accept those groups can be harmed. Okay, so that's values. What are frames? Values are like the passengers, and frames are like the car. They transport the values to your audience. So the primary way that our values are activated is through the language we use. And when we communicate, we use mental shortcuts. So our brains do not look at the world and process everything as if it's from the first time that we see it. That it would be too exhausting. So instead, we think in frames. It's a mental shortcut, and it tells us about a process or some properties, or it can be used to activate certain values. So for example, in the guide, I mentioned when you say supermarket, you have a particular frame. And we're going to look at some other frames during the course of the presentation. For now, I'm going to explain to you or illustrate this, how you can use a frame to activate values with an experiment. So there were some experimenters, and they got a group of people together to play a game. And they divided the group in two. And one group was told that the game was called the Wall Street game. And the other group was told that the game was called the community game. Now, the rules for both games were exactly the same. Each player had some resources, and round by round in this game, they could either choose to betray the other player or to cooperate and share resources with them. So I'm going to do another poll now in the chat. If you think people who played the Wall Street game were more likely to share their resources with the other person, type share. If you think people who played the Wall Street game were more likely to betray the other person, type betray in the chat. Remember, it was exactly the same game, just with a different title. Yeah. This is true, yeah. They were more likely to betray other people. So the word community evokes a frame. Okay, you say community and it probably makes you think about solidarity, cooperation, working together, sharing things, common goals. It's probably going to be triggering values of benevolence and universalism. And similarly, if you say Wall Street, that evokes a frame in popular culture. People competing with each other, being cutthroat, stabbing each other in the back, trying to be the strongest. It probably triggers values around achievement and power. So yeah, people who were told they were playing the community game were more likely to cooperate. And people who were told they were playing the Wall Street game were more likely to betray each other. So we use language, we use frames, and they can activate particular values. And that will have an impact on how people see an issue and even how they behave. Now, there are other similar experiments that also show that this is relevant and this has an impact on the policy choices people support as well. I don't have time to go over those further examples, but I'll send the organizers some further reading if you want to dig into that. Okay, so that's chunk one out of the way. Now we're going to look at the kinds of things that we should try and avoid when we are communicating. And I've tried to adapt these specifically to the current context. Okay, now frequently we actually repeat damaging frames around an issue that have been created by authoritarians in order to further their agenda. And sometimes we do that just because it's become the common way of talking about that issue. So it's the label that the media uses to talk about this issue. Or it's kind of become, just the phrase that we use, the concept around it's become the common sense phrase. Or maybe you want to talk about a piece of legislation or a proposal and you're using the full title of the legislation and the law contains that negative frame. So I'll give you an example, a recent example from Hungary. The government has enacted an emergency coronavirus law. And the government's narrative is that this legislation, which actually suspends parliament and allows the government to rule by decree, is necessary in order to protect public health. And that is framed in the title of the law itself, the emergency coronavirus law. But what's actually going on is there's been a pattern of over 10 years in Hungary of the dismantlement of democracy, and this is just another excuse to allow the government to further its agenda. So really what's happening here, this is more of a dictatorship law. It's a law that creates dictatorship. But what you see is many human rights activists, especially those with a legal background, will continue using the emergency coronavirus law, even though they're trying to argue that this is a law that creates a dictatorship. So that would be an example of where you would try to think, is the frame that I'm using here actually helping to convey what I want to say, or am I just repeating and cementing the frame that I'm trying to fight against? So here you might instead use something like the dictatorship law. Now, this can be quite a problem for us because sometimes authoritarians actually hijack the frames that we use and they turn them into something negative. And they're very good at it because the media likes to spread their sensationalist messages. So in Spain, for example, I had the impression that the word menas, it used to be a neutral, almost kind of scientific term to describe unaccompanied migrants. And throughout a lot of negative campaigning by authoritarians, it's a term that arguably has now acquired negative connotations, which means that using it nowadays may actually be harmful because you may be activating that frame which authoritarians have associated with delinquency. And if this is the case, then you might want to think about using different words. So you might just talk about them in terms that are accurate, which is that they're children. It could be that simple. Similarly, I think in many countries, the term migrant has been turned into something that's negative, that has negative connotations associated with crimes or threats to our resources. And so there's some research which suggests that actually nowadays it might just be better to, as progressives, use a term that is people who come here, because you're simply describing human beings who have come to another country. Another reason that we might end up repeating a damaging frame that is when we're trying to contradict what the other side is saying, okay? So somebody says that, for example, around coronavirus, you have to sacrifice your rights in order to protect public health. we might reply to that directly by saying, no, you don't have to sacrifice your rights to protect public health. And even though you're trying to make the case to protect rights, what you're doing is cementing a frame that makes rights and health look incompatible with each other. This is one of the things that I focused on in the guide. And we saw the same thing during the war on terror, where government said, well, if we want security, we have to give up some of our human rights. And many activists kind of repeated the narrative accidentally, saying, actually, rights are more important. We don't have to compromise on our rights to have security. But you still cement this frame, which portrays these two things as being in conflict with each other. So instead, you have to try and think like, okay, what is it that I want to say positively about this thing that I'm talking about? And so in the guide, you could see that there I suggested, well, we should talk about human rights as tools that we use to make sure that our governments put the interests of everyone at the forefront of decision making. And it's not that that means we can never talk about points where there may be restrictions on rights that are necessary to protect health, but that doesn't become the only thing that we talk about. It becomes one of the things that we talk about, but in a much broader context where people are hearing things about rights which explain how rights help to make the situation better and help us by giving us the tools to create the lives that we want, the communities that we want. So it's not that we can't say certain things, it's more the order in which you make your arguments and the relative weight between the messages that you're putting out. Okay, another example that we might think of, which is similar to this, where you're trying to contradict what authoritarians are saying and then accidentally maybe reinforce it, is these kind of campaigns that we might see about regularization of migrants who don't have documentation. So the authoritarian narrative is people are here illegally, and they use the term illegal immigrants. And often our reaction has been to say, well, actually, no human being is illegal. And we kind of use that as our motto to say that people should have their status regularized. And even though the substance of what we're saying is right, we're saying it by repeating the frame that's used by authoritarians, which connects migration with illegality, and therefore activates those security and conformity values and makes people link migration with something that's threatening and makes people think of those who come to our country as somehow separate from us, a separate part of humanity. So instead, you could try and think about, okay, let's try and build a frame around what we want to say, which is that we're all human, we have a shared humanity and we all depend on each other. So then you might start off with something like, the virus reminds us that we're all human and that we all depend on each other for our well-being. Now, these things have implications for one of the tools that activists and newspapers really like to use a lot, which is myth busting. So increasingly we're faced with misinformation from authoritarians. What happens when you myth bust? I mean, this is kind of maybe an extreme example of what myth busting looks like, but often this is it. We put the myth in big capital letters, and it's short and it's easy to remember, and then the truth is like 10 lines of explanation, probably with statistics and maybe a pie chart somewhere, which is not very easy to remember. When you contradict a frame, you reinforce that frame. Why? Because to contradict it, you have to repeat it. Okay? So studies on myth busting show that myth busting will just reinforce the myths that you're trying to debunk. And it actually make people more likely to attribute those myths to the organization that is trying to bust them. Okay? So if you're trying to bust myths, in the long run, people might actually remember you as the source of the myth and remember only the myth. The other thing that you're doing is activating the negative values that are in the original frame, and that's also not going to be good for you. One of the other reasons that myth busting doesn't work is because people will reject facts that conflict with the frame that they have on an issue. Okay, I will explain what that means with a concrete example. This is important beyond myth busting, because often we like to communicate just with facts. we will present the facts, we will present the statistics that show how many people are living in poverty and expect them to speak for themselves. We think that the truth will set people free. And the problem is that if the facts don't fit the concepts that people have around this topic, the way they think that this issue works, the way that they think about the causes behind it, then they'll just reject those facts. So they will say, this doesn't reflect my personal experience, it doesn't reflect what I've read in the media, or they will say, well, there must be some kind of bias in the way that this data was collected. So to give a concrete example, we've seen during the pandemic that many NGOs have tried to use this as a time to draw extra attention to the problem of structural discrimination. And one common way to do that is to show testimonies from victims of discrimination, or to show statistics about incidents of discrimination, or how certain marginalized groups have a worse economic position or worse position in the job market, or don't have the same level of access to healthcare or to education or to housing. And the problem is that many people in society already have a particular set frame around discrimination. I don't know exactly what the frame is around discrimination in Spain, but there is some research around how people think about discrimination in the USA, for example. And it wouldn't surprise me if this was quite similar in other Western countries. But sort of your movable middle audience in the USA thinks that structural discrimination doesn't exist because there are laws against discrimination. And the laws create the structure, and therefore that means there can't be structural discrimination. So equality laws means no structural discrimination. So people will accept that there are differences between the majority population and marginalized communities in terms of their social and economic position, but they will believe that these differences are due to differences in work ethic and morality. So put otherwise, they will believe that everybody in society actually has the same opportunities. Everybody has to work hard to get what they want, including the person from the majority population. And the only reason that marginalized groups are doing worse in life is because they're prone to criminality and to laziness. Because these are the myths that have been perpetuated in the media and by authoritarian politicians. They will accept that there are some individuals in society who are racist and that they should be punished by criminal law, but they don't accept that the way we've structured our society as a whole discriminates against marginalized groups. So the researchers found that this was the dominant way of thinking, and then they thought, okay, let's look at how activists usually try to counter this misapprehension. So they used kind of the traditional evidence-based arguments to show that, look, there is a difference between social and economic status. The evidence shows it. Or here is the evidence to show how historic white privilege works. Or here is the evidence to show the value of diversity to our economy, for example. And these arguments, they didn't convince people. They didn't work because people just, in the focus groups and the conversations they were having, kept coming back round to the same dominant frame, which is the reason that the majority population does well isn't to do with discrimination. It's because we work hard and we obey the law, and minority communities don't. I'm going to return to this example when I'm talking about what we should be doing instead, to explain one way that researchers have found that explains structural discrimination in a convincing manner. Before I finish off here in this part with things that we should avoid doing, of course, sometimes we do have to respond to an attack or a lie directly. I'm not saying that we can't do that. We just don't use myth busting. Instead, we use a technique called the truth sandwich. And I explain in the guide how that works. So I won't go over it here, but there is a technique to do that. Okay, so deep breath. Let's look at the things that we should be saying instead. If we want our narratives to be effective, then we need to think about certain ingredients that go into them. Usually, our default way of talking is to just focus on the injustice, to raise awareness about the problem, and you can kind of summarize the way we communicate as, there are those people over there who are suffering and it's not right, and so we should stop it because people shouldn't suffer. And this kind of messaging, it might be enough to move some of your base because they already agree, they already have kind of, their values are already activated all the time. They know how they want society to look. But just pointing to the problem like this, just pointing to kind of a group over there that needs kind of helping, usually won't go much further. It won't reach the middle. So if you want to try and reach a broader audience, the thing that you should do is reorder what you're saying. So it's not that you don't talk about the problems, but your starting point should be slightly different. So your starting point should be more, you take a step back and you start to think about what is it that we stand for? What is it that we find important, that other people should find important? So what should society actually look like? It's what I call a values statement. And for us, this often involves a human right. So I've set out some examples based on some of the information that you guys sent me in advance about the context you're working in. Now, it's not enough just to talk about rights in your opening statement. So it's not enough just to say we all believe in equality, or we all think that discrimination is a bad thing, or we all think that a free press is important. It's not enough to do that because, for the most part, the movable middle does not have a frame for those concepts. So they don't know what they mean. They don't trigger a set of connotations about how we use something like privacy, or how we use something like freedom of expression or freedom of assembly. And that means that our kind of opening statement has to be an explanation of the rights that we're talking about. And we do that by appealing to, by explaining the rights in a way that appeals to values of universalism, benevolence, and self-direction. So if you look at this way of explaining freedom of assembly, we want our governments, basically we want our governments to do the right thing during the pandemic, to take the right decisions. And therefore we need a way to talk to our leaders about what they're doing so that they take decisions that are good for all of us. And that's why we have a right to peaceful assembly. It allows us to come together, to join our voices so that our representatives can hear us. And it's by talking to our representatives while they're in power, in between elections, when they're actually taking the decisions, that we bring democracy to life. Okay, so there you kind of break down in a few sentences a technical term that we tend to use, freedom of assembly, or the right to protest. If you say just kind of the right to protest, people might just have negative connotations of what they've seen on TV of violent protests, because the media is always showing violent protests because it's more sensational. So you need to break this down for your audience and do it in a way that will activate their values. And here what we're doing is appealing to probably values of self-direction, because it's about us having freedom to be able to take control over our lives by talking to our leaders and telling them what it is that's important to us. So here's an example of how you might open by explaining to people why they should care about structural discrimination. So rather than starting out by saying X number of people have worse health outcomes because they belong to a marginalized community, you start out with the general principle by saying, look, everyone, all of us agree that no matter who we are, where we're born, we're all supposed to have the same opportunities in life. Like, most of us want the same thing: a fair paying job, a home, so we can provide for our families, a community that we can belong to, for our kids to go to school, get an education, to know that we can get healthcare if we need it. Like, these are common shared values. And you do a similar thing, I think, for population when you're talking about at-risk groups. Okay, so here I'm suggesting one way that you could do it, which the pandemic makes clear that our health depends on everybody else's. So my health depends on the person in the next door, next town. We're all connected to each other. We can only stop the virus spreading and keep each other safe if we give everybody the same care and support, regardless of where they're living. And that includes people who are in confined spaces, whether that's a care home, a home for persons with disabilities, or a shelter for people who don't have a home, or people who are detained in prison, or newcomers who are being held in centers. Now, notice what I'm doing in this third example and in this second example. We're talking about marginalized or at-risk groups. Usually, we tend to talk about these categories as people over there who are separate from us. And there are two ways in which we do this. Sometimes we say, look at those people over there who are suffering, let's treat them properly because it's not nice to let people suffer. Or another way that we try to get people to care is to say, look, these people are performing important jobs that we rely on. They're in the care industry, or they are out there in the fields getting food for us. So they deserve to be treated properly because they contribute. But if you speak about it differently, if you start off with shared values, when you set out something that we all find important, then what you're doing is creating a much bigger concept of we that actually includes the marginalized groups who you later want to focus on. Okay, and it makes it more likely that you're going to create empathy rather than creating sympathy. So you're saying that the reason your audience should support inclusion or equality is because they want this treatment for themselves and the people they love and care about. So you're not doing it by making them imagine that they were part of this marginalized group. That can be difficult because that experience is too far removed for us. Instead, you're making it personal by connecting it to our own shared vision of what we want society to look like. You're telling them this is the kind of society that you want to live in, right? And that's where you're activating those kinds of values. And you're also not doing this by saying that, look, there are some people who deserve this kind of treatment. The problem with doing it like that is that we're saying that these people are valuable because of what they did, rather than this person is someone just like us, so we should treat them just like us. Right? So in one of the versions, it might be effective for specific exceptions, but you're still treating this kind of group as separate. Whereas if you use kind of the more value statement approach, you're making everybody part of the same group, the same society that you want to build. So I think that is generally a way that you should consider starting when you're speaking to a kind of a movable middle audience. Then the next step is to break down the problem that you're facing. So what process, what set of circumstances is leading to the problem, to the human rights violation? What person or organization or interests are behind this problem? Now, this is not how a lot of the human rights sector likes to talk. So very often, especially lawyers, we're trained to speak about violations in the passive voice, like there's nobody responsible for them, like they just, kind of just popped out of the ground. But you do need to show that someone or something is behind the problem, or there is some kind of process behind it, to make sure that people realize it's not natural, it's not inevitable. It's happening because we're doing something or we're not doing something and we're allowing it to happen. If you don't explain why or how the problem is happening, then people won't be open to your solution about how to stop it. They will just kind of think, well, it's a bad situation, but it's kind of inevitable. Whereas if you break down what's happening, they'll be more likely to be able to be thinking, okay, if we can do this thing that creates that problem, then we can also do that thing differently, which creates a solution. So I've tried to adapt this abstract advice for the three issues that I put also in the first part, the value statement. It's kind of hypothetical because I'm not exactly certain of what the situation is in Spain at the moment. But here, the government has banned peaceful protests. They say it's to protect public health, but we citizens, we look out for each other and we can find ways to demonstrate in a safe and responsible manner. What's really going on here is that some politicians just don't want to listen to what the public has to say about how we want to invest money in hospitals or into social security. Instead, they're more interested in giving public money to a few powerful billionaires who own banks or powerful corporations. And that's why they've banned peaceful protests. So, as I say, this may not necessarily apply to the context in Spain, but it's to illustrate how you might unpack a problem. What I've tried to do here is also illustrate two things. One, it's an example of what I would call, what Lakoff calls, George Lakoff, he calls it a truth sandwich. So if you were to put this together, with the first piece over here, you'd have kind of a truth sandwich. You'd have a statement of what your frame is, what your values are, and then you'd have an explanation of who is doing what to violate those values, but also why they are doing it. Why are they lying about why public protest is being banned? So that is kind of also an illustration of a truth sandwich. But the other thing that this illustrates is that it's possible to criticize politicians without necessarily undermining trust in the institution of government. So I know that there is some concern that when we attack government, we may undermine public trust, which is a bad thing because we need public trust to support the solutions that we're asking government to execute. And the way that you can do this is by explaining that it's not government necessarily that's bad, and it's not all politicians that are bad, it's some corporate interests, it's some politicians. And at the same time, keep explaining what it is that government as an institution should be doing and why we need government. So that way you kind of avoid undervaluing the institution while pointing out that there may be a problem with politicians, some politicians. In this example on at-risk groups, you can see that I deliberately did not label them as vulnerable groups. If you use the word vulnerable, which we do in a lot of our communications at the moment, it gives the impression that there is an inherent weakness in this group. This group is weaker than us and they're not as good as we are. It's better to use a term like at risk because that allows you to explain that there are decisions about the way we've formed our society that have put people at greater risk. So it's not them, it's a vulnerability or a risk that we have created. We've designed it into the system. And if we made a system in a way that puts people at risk, then we can make it in a different way that doesn't put people at risk. I used the example of prisons here, but you could probably adapt this for other at-risk groups. And then on structural discrimination, to explain the problem, I've used a particular technique. I've used a metaphor. Okay, so in explaining the problem, for people in our communities to have the same opportunities, it means our communities have to have access to the same resources. So the same schools, hospitals, parks, museums, social services. Being connected to resources is like being connected to the national electricity grid. So this is a metaphor. It's a metaphor that these researchers in the US who were looking at explaining structural discrimination used. They used the idea that resources are like electricity, and if you think of the electricity grid with the power cables that run around the country, what they would explain is that if you're on the grid, you've got access to resources. If you're not connected to the grid, you don't have access to resources. And so they used this metaphor. And what they said was some of our communities are well connected, but some of them are not. Some of the communities are off grid. And this is a problem that disproportionately affects communities from, and then you would explain whichever marginalized group you were talking about at the time. So what they found was that this was an effective way of getting their audience to understand how structural discrimination works, and therefore to acknowledge that it exists. They gave people a frame to understand the issue, and with that frame, they can then put the facts and the rationality and the logic about the extent of the problem. But first, you needed to have a frame, kind of break down the problem for them so they could see how it functioned. And this frame could replace the damaging, the negative, the false frames that they had before. So metaphors are a kind of frame. They're a kind of shortcut. You can either explain a problem with a step-by-step prosaic explanation, or you can use a metaphor. And we use metaphors all the time in our thinking. It's a very important building block of the way that we think. There's been some other research in the UK about which metaphors work to explain structural discrimination. And if somebody reminds me, I will include that reading in a follow-up reading. Okay, so I'm probably about to run over. So final stage now is to think about solutions. We have to include a solution when we're trying to motivate people to change their attitudes on something or to support what we're asking for. Now, the human rights sector, in my experience, we're very good at just talking about a problem, and then we don't say very much about how to put it right. Sometimes we put a sentence at the end of an article which says more needs to be done to protect this right, or more action needs to be taken to ensure, or this law must be rejected. But we don't then put in its place a solution where people can see how it is that the mechanics of the problem can be taken apart or changed. You don't need to talk about detailed policies that will put people off, but you do need some kind of broad solution that sounds like common sense. Of course, when it comes to the level of advocacy, you're going to need detailed policies, but not when you're talking to a kind of a broader public audience. So you have to include a solution because people need to see that there is a course of action they can get behind that will make things better. If they don't see that there's a viable solution, they'll feel that there's nothing that can be done, and they will not be receptive to your message. And the solutions that you should talk about should be structural. So you shouldn't be talking about what you as an individual can do. I mean, it's not that you should never talk about that. It's fine, but your main messaging should be around how do we change the system. So for example, if you were the environmental movement, I would say concentrate a lot less on telling people to buy an energy-saving light bulb and concentrate a lot more on telling the government to subsidize energy-saving light bulbs or to make subsidies for renewable energy. It's that kind of structural level solution. And ideally, in our field, we might be explaining how human rights offers the solution. I've given you, again, some kind of hypothetical examples here of how you might explain a solution. And you know, it's relatively short. You would kind of adapt this for the size of your campaign or the materials, your communications materials at the time. So for freedom of assembly, you might just say, well, look, we can use our right to peaceful protest responsibly, make sure that our representatives listen to our concerns while we look out for other people's health. And if they refuse to listen, well, then we can choose politicians who will work for all of us. Or you might say the solution is, if they refuse to listen, then we can turn to the courts. Or on the right to health for at-risk groups, you know, we could protect the health of everybody by allowing people who are already being prepared for release to leave detention to be released and instead be monitored in their homes. And this will create enough space for prisoners who need to serve their sentences to keep a safe distance while in detention. Or on structural discrimination, you know, this thing that is so complicated, because you've used this kind of relatively simple power grid example, then the kind of the solution becomes pretty obvious. You just, okay, then we make sure that everybody has the same communities. Sorry, everybody has the same opportunities by making sure that all of our communities, no matter where they are, all have access to the same quality of public services. You're not talking about the detailed policy that you would have to execute and the logistics to make that happen, but you are talking about the structural solution. Okay, I will end there. I will pass these slides on to the organizers. It will include my email address and some extra reading, but I'll also try to include some other stuff in an email. So yeah, I'm all yours now.
Thank you so much, Israel. It was not only very, very useful, at least for me, but it was also right on time. So you probably have it already tested that it fit the time very much. And thank you so much, Israel, as well, for making the effort to bring it down, the example, so these strategies actually meet some examples that can be relevant in Spain. I think we all find some inspiring ideas in here. Si os parece, abriríamos ahora el turno de preguntas y respuestas, porque no quiero empezar yo, aunque tengo algunas dudas y algunas preguntas, pero por favor, como comentamos, si queréis preguntar algo, escribir en el question and answer o preguntas y respuestas si tenéis el interfaz en español, como para levantar la mano, y así recogemos unas cuantas preguntas, os daría paso. Pero necesito que levantéis la mano quien quiera intervenir. Mientras tanto, Israel you probably know, because we've sent you the information, like the people who are actually listening are from different NGOs, most of them human rights NGOs, others not specifically human rights NGOs, but are working on the field of that. And we have, in fact, in the audience, many communication officers, so people who are in charge of communication campaigns, which I think was, for us, was the target public very much, since, as I said at the beginning, like this dilemma, it's always in our work and how we do it and how we stop talking to the convinced ones, the believers. Some people talk about believers as well, and how we start talking about this middle part. I don't see anybody raising their hands. Okay, I have Thais from Novak who wants to speak. Si nadie más me levanta la mano, le pido a Thais que se quite el mute del micrófono y adelante, Thais.
Hi. Can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me. Hello.
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay, perfect. sorry, because I was thinking I was talking alone. Okay, actually from Novak, we are working in a platform that it's called Defender a quien defiende, that I think you already read about it, because I think I sent you some questions to you, Israel, related to the campaign we are doing now in this context of the COVID. And some of the questions I had, you already answered in your presentation, and thank you so much for it, because I agree with Aida that it's very useful for us, all the things you talk to us. But I have I have a question. It is important to know the people, the right they have. I mean, we want people to know their rights. I work in the sphere of police brutality and also all the repressive laws that we have now in Spain. And sometimes I don't know if it's necessary to explain to the common people the rights that they have when a police officer stops them, or if they have some situation with the police, because and I want to explain more, because now the context that we are living in Spain, it happens that people that are facing some problems with the police, it's the first time that they face this problem. You know what I mean? Because before we had activists or people that they're used to the relation with the police, but now what we have is common people that they feel that the police, that they are supposed to protect them, but then now they have a problem with the police because they are not protecting them, but they are putting fines or using bad words to them, and this kind of feelings. Okay, so sometimes I have the doubt if we have to explain specific rights to all the people or not, because by the other hand, we have people that they are using it to individual freedom, and that's all. They don't mind, they don't think about human rights, but they write, and that's all. So I don't know what you think, if it is important or not to pay attention to these small rights that, or to explain more in detail these rights. I don't know if you understand quite the question.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Israel.
So, I think it is useful to explain to people what their rights are. But what's probably more useful also for your long-term work is to also explain to them why they have these rights. So why is it that I might have a right to protest or a right to free movement? What is it about this thing that's so important for me, for my life in my community, for my relationship between me and the government, that we decided that it's going to be a right? And if you do that, you start to create a broader appreciation of people in society about why this right exists. And I think that is important because, you know, many people, yeah, are being stopped by the police, but numerically, most people aren't. And so if you're not, if you don't have this negative experience, then you kind of just think, oh, well, these, you know, unfortunate people over there, they must have been doing something wrong, or it hasn't happened to me. And so you might not necessarily care so much about it. But if what you want to do in the end is to encourage the police service to be seen, to act in a different way, and to actually be a service which is part of the community and helps the community, is built out of the community, then you have to get people to think differently, and to understand what their rights are for, not just why they have them. And this can be, yeah, about explaining to people what representative democracy means and how it works. It can also be about getting people to have a different frame and a different concept about what policing is about. Is the dominant frame, or the frame that is spread about policing, that it is about law and order, or is it about a service from a community for a community that is built on trust and respect, that is less about solving crime and more about helping to create a harmonious and prosperous community. And it may be that it's not for the scope of your particular organization to do that wider conversation, but it can be useful if that element about why we have these rights and what policing should be, if that is out there and part of the discussion as well, because that's how you'll get sort of the longer term change. I think of course it's valuable to explain to people what their rights are and how they can preserve their freedoms, and this will work on an individual level. But yeah, if your goal is to have a broader change in the longer term, you need to shift public attitudes and help people appreciate these rights and what they do.
I have Jaume from UCLG that also wants to talk. Please, Jaume, the floor is yours.
Now, I think that you can hear me. Okay. Yes? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, Jaume.
Hello, Israel. So I'm Jaume, and I work as a communication officer at the Human Rights Committee of UCLG. I don't know if you know our organization, but it is a city network. We gather local governments from across the world and foster cooperation among them. And I'm working specifically at the Human Rights Committee. So all the topics that you mentioned and the way you approached them were very, very, very interesting. I wanted to ask you my first question was if you see any good and bad practices in regards of the way that local governments specifically have communicated around quarantine measures and the human rights implications of them, regarding also that thing that you mentioned about the need to also to be able to criticize governments as part of the process of building trust. And also if you could give some ideas for arguments that we could make on how to convince also local governments to engage more actively in human rights language when developing their communication. What could give them and in which way could enhance their action? Okay, that would be my question.
It's a tricky one. Okay, do I see a good and bad practice? I think, I mean, this is very much from my own anecdotal perspective, but what I see local governments doing is just doing stuff without really explaining what they're doing or why, and people kind of just have to work out from what other people are saying about why it might be. And in that sense, the way that I was breaking down how you explain problems and solutions and how you explain rights, explanation is actually a really important element of getting to people to understand why something is done in a particular way, and also then allowing them to work out whether they want to buy into that or not, and whether they have their own ideas about how to do things differently. So I guess it's part of accountability. It's part of what makes representative democracy work properly and participation work properly. In terms of how to convince local governments, I think, I mean, most of the people who don't work directly on human rights don't really know what human rights are about or what they do. So I think you probably have to take a step back, and rather than trying to say to a local government, you know, explain what you are doing in human rights terms, is more, getting them to explain what they are doing in terms that make people understand that that they understand that people have freedoms, that they may have to put on pause for a while, that we're doing this because we look out for each other and it's for the good of the community. And so I guess speaking in ways that explain to people which freedoms they have, how these freedoms relate to each other. So, you know, if a local government says, you know, all of us value the ability that we have to go and visit our relatives or go for a walk in the park or have a chat with someone down the supermarket. And this is the way that we live our life. This is part of our life. You know, at the moment, we're going to have to put that on hold a little bit. It's not a repressive measure. We're just doing what is helpful so that we can all look out for each other. So you're kind of talking about it in a way that activates those values that are to do with benevolence and universalism. And what you're talking about in legal terms is proportionality. So a lawyer would say this has to be a proportionate measure. But I think that if local councils start saying we are limiting free movement rights, these measures are justified, necessary, and proportionate, most people they're just not going to understand the reasoning around that. So in that sense, I think local authorities, it's not that they have to start using human rights language, but what you tend to find is that if you look at what human rights do, they actually coincide quite well with what is good governance and accountability. So the kinds of things that people actually want to live anyway. And once you start talking about it in those terms, then yeah, sure, you can explain to people, you know, by the way, what I just explained to you, we call the right to free movement, or you know, what I just explained to you is the right to a free press. But that kind of comes afterwards. What's most important, I think, at the beginning is to step behind the rights and talk to people in kind of those more values-based terms. I hope I answered your question.
I think so. We have 31 very shy people apparently, or non-thoughtful people without questions. Anybody actually who wants to raise their hand? Okay. I got Elizabeth Obliquas. We are going to unmute you now. Elizabeth, it's yours.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering that since the context is changing right now, I feel in Spain, due to the end, well, it's approaching the end of the lockdown, I feel we used to have a culture based on empathy, or everybody was more keen of cooperating with their communities. But right now I feel like the context is changing. It's a bit uncertain. I feel we might get back to individualistic values where we are all looking ahead on what we are really looking forward to do after the lockdown. And so how is this going to affect in how we frame our narratives? Like, should we still be basing our narratives and frames on empathy and community? And also in a context where we are one of the most polarized societies in Europe. So we do not have a huge unmovable movable middle. So we do have progressive and authoritarian societies with a very small movable middle in Spain. So is it still valid to talk about community and empathy? Should we keep on building on that so that we move those in the middle? Thank you.
One of the things about living through this kind of crisis is that I think you get two sorts of narratives that are amplified. So one of the things you see is a lot of threat narratives around, our health is under threat, and that's something kind of constant. And the war metaphor, where people talk about being at war against this invisible enemy, and so you have these kinds of narratives that will activate the wrong kinds of values, which can push people towards more authoritarian attitudes. But at the same time, this kind of crisis also can produce a different narrative. As you say, you've had a lot of examples of solidarity and a sense of community growing, and people realizing that they're only physically distant, not socially distant, and people working together. So in that sense, you've had circumstances that have been emphasizing both of these. But what's good is that you have had these kind of collective values that are emphasized, and people will have been experiencing this different way of life, this different way of relating to people and building a sense of community. So in that sense, yeah, the rhythm of daily life will change, but I think it's possible to appeal to the things that people saw improve in their lives as ways of activating the right kinds of values. So, you're not telling people that they should go back to lockdown, but you can say to people, remember when we all looked out for each other, and maybe you couldn't do this, or maybe you needed that, and your neighbor helped with that, or so-and-so helped with that, or a stranger took care of your mother, or those kinds of experiences. So what the situation gives us is a range of experiences that people will be able to relate to, that trigger the values that underpin progressive attitudes. So even though we're kind of maybe going back to how it was, there's still this set of personal experience that you can draw on if you want to, that will be real for people, that will help to activate those values. So in that sense, I still think that there is kind of a library there that you can use. I think that it's also possible to talk to people about change, the possibility for changing. So we saw a lot of really big things, unthinkable things change just like that. Unthinkable that people would stay inside. It was unthinkable that a government would nationalize the health service. Unthinkable that suddenly there would be universal income. So these are things that politicians, especially in the center right, will have been telling people for a long time. It's not possible. It's not possible. The economy will collapse. People will not tolerate it. So you can also point to these unprecedented developments that were positive for society as a way of saying, hey, we just managed to do this like that, then yes, we can actually make all of these other changes as well. We can choose now to keep our skies clean by not bailing out fossil fuel companies, or we can choose to have a strong public health system by making sure it's in the hands of the taxpayer. So I think that in that sense, it's possible to look back at positive things that happened as ways of reminding, activating certain values, but also showing people that positive change is possible. As long as you don't call COVID an opportunity, that's really distasteful. It's not an opportunity. It's just a time when we can take decisions, because we put things on pause and now we're kind of restarting. And the other thing is that the values associated with self-direction, they are about individual freedom and creativity and independence. So these are all about individual rights and freedoms. So yeah, maybe this is also a time to remind people, what is it that you missed and what is it that you're most looking forward to? Oh, you're looking forward to, you know, go down the bar and have a coffee with your friends. Everybody finds that important, and that's why it's actually a right to freedom of movement. Oh yeah, that's a story about rights that we really value and use all the time. So, and you know, or you could say, remember these decisions that the government's made that kind of changed the direction of how we went through this crisis. Well, you know, that was because we have a free media, and so it was actually this human right that got us through that in that kind of shape. So you can use the things around you that people still find fresh and relatable to tell stories about how we use human rights and how they're important to us. And in terms of whether you still concentrate on empathy and community, yeah, if you're going to be especially speaking about marginalized groups, you have to create a sense of empathy. We just have to be careful in that a lot of our advocacy, accidentally, we don't do it on purpose, but it kind of creates sympathy instead. We talk about a separate group rather than speaking about all of us. And I think that one of the things that the epidemic has done is to show that we're all human, is to remind us that we're all in the same, we can all share the same experiences, while at the same time, it also showed us that we have a system in place that puts some people at greater risk, and none of us wants that. So we should actually change that. So I think yes, still appeal to sense of community, still try to create empathy. That will always be the case when in your messaging. You should always be trying to activate those values. What's different is that you now have kind of a bank of experiences that people can relate to, where you can tell positive stories about human rights and about how we can use them to change things for the better.
Thank you very much, Israel. I think the time's up and we should be punctual, since we said that we were going to stop at 1:30. So I will not take more questions at this point. And I will remind you that, yeah, we will forward Israel's presentation as he offered it to send it to us, to all of you, so you can have the references and all the content that Israel has given us today. And as well, we will write, our Center of Resources of Human Rights will write an article on the conclusions and some of the ideas that were explained here, that we will share with everybody, so we can also circulate it. I just wanted to finish, of course, by thanking you, Israel. As I said, it's been very, very inspiring. And to thank you especially for being able to give concrete examples, because most of the time, and it happens all the time when you are actually talking and explaining human rights, you miss this connection with the very daily life issues that matters, of course, for human rights, and that are most of the time the best language to actually reach out to many other people. And it's an exercise that sometimes is difficult for we all very rational people, and that we see very clear. And it's very useful actually to have these concrete examples. I will just, let me just finish by bringing an idea to the debate that maybe will like trigger another encounter, and has to do with the with the idea of the feeling of belonging and identities and multiple identities, and how this is by groups that have been felt and actually discriminated and marginalized for a long time, felt very strongly, and how we can actually like bring this together with the idea of humanity in a whole, and how this frame of value actually you can put it together with this appropriation and strong identities and feeling of belonging. I think this will bring another debate, but I just leave it here for maybe another time, because I think it can bring new ideas and very interesting. Anyhow, let me finish here. As I said, thank you to Israel, but thank you to all of you that have been listening, and to people who have actually throw questions and ideas. This is food for thoughts, as I said in the beginning, and we from the City Council, and especially from the Center of Resources of Human Rights, we think that this is one of the functions that we can provide to our organized civil society, to have these spaces of debate and reflection, especially in the times that are coming, where all these ideas are going to be always important and very essential to the future that comes. Just to finish with an idea, which for us, especially like from the public policies we have been developing in the last years, it's very relevant, the idea that when you are actually contradicting a frame, you are reinforcing this frame. We have been for years, actually, in the sense, reinforcing the frame by contradicting when it comes to discrimination and human rights. So something to keep in mind and reflect. And yeah, moltes gràcies. Gràcies, Israel. No sé si vols dir, if you want to say bye or...
Thanks very much. And you can drop me a line if you have any other questions as well.
Thank you. Moltes gràcies a tothom. I molta salut. Cuideu-vos molt.